I minored in poli-sci.
Gotta have a little if you're a debater, you know?
Yeah.
A little background.
Only 5 minutes on the clock. We all ready?
Yes, sir.
Alright. Starting now, just like always, thank you for being here and judging. We really look forward to your feedback so we can be better. This is my first time debating Lindsay in quite some time, but we're very good friends, so I'm excited for the chance again. Hopefully I don't look too bad on the video later on. That being said, let's get into the resolution, which is originalism ought to be the preferred method for constitutional interpretation. Now, really quickly, I'm going to have to define what originalism is for the sake of this round, but I think that Justice Amy Coney Barrett described it best when she said that originalism is the belief that constitutional text means what it did at the time it was written, and that this public meaning is authoritative. And I'll get into how they discover what the public meaning was at the time a little on later, but what you need to know is basically the same ideas that are written out in the Constitution back then are the same ideas that drive court decisions today. So that's pretty much the only thing I'm going to define there. The weighing mechanism is going to be preponderance of logic. So after you've been given all the logic for which type of interpretation is best and evidence based on that, then you basically make an informed decision over which one you would rather your Supreme Court use. That brings me to my very first contention, with all the housekeeping out of the way, is that originalism does not equal outdated. Originalism does not equal outdated. Subpoint A, an example of this, would be free speech, and Neil Gorsuch talks about this by saying originalism basically just means that the ideas and the way they are laid out are unchanging. And the way he relates this to free speech is that, of course, there was no internet around whenever the Constitution was written. But the same rules of free speech that applied to newspapers back then now apply to the internet and things of that nature. Same thing with the gun debate and the right to bear arms. There's a big argument that says, okay, well, when it was written, they only had single-shot muskets, which kind of gives you the idea that they had no imagination for what kind of weaponry can turn into, despite the fact that Da Vinci was already designing tanks in the 1400s. I think it's pretty easy to say they knew what it would turn into whenever they wrote that. So again, it's the idea that the rights enumerated apply and are timeless, no matter the advances in technology that happen. Subpoint C under this is basically how they decide the original meaning. The same way that an English literature teacher decides what Beowulf means or what Shakespeare means, by going to contemporary sources and looking at the writing and terms of those sources, many of them which were written by authors of the Constitution, and basically them expounding what they meant by these ideas. So you can figure out basically what how Amy Coney Barrett described it was the meaning of the text is fixed as long as it is discoverable. So as soon as you can discover that meaning, the text is fixed and you apply to that. Now, this leads me to my second point, which is one of the two benefits I'll talk about. And it's the primary argument for why originalism is the best. And that's because it limits judge bias. So that's contention 2, limiting judge bias. Subpoint A under this are predilections. So basically Antonin Scalia, who was also an originalist, gave a speech and basically said that the reason this is here is so that judges cannot impart their own predilections onto the Constitution. They can't say what they want the Constitution to mean versus what it actually meant. If you interpret some of the Constitution, there are ways to interpret them where you can get completely vast results over what they were originally meant as. And this is meant to limit that. This leads me to subpoint B, which is that basically any judge can change what the Constitution means with the right amount of spin, as long as they're not originalists. And that's very dangerous because judges weren't intended to be policymakers, they were intended to be interpreters. And what you have now is people who aren't originalists making their own policy and then picking and choosing what words of the Constitution support that. And that brings me to my final contention, the third contention, which is it forces real constitutional change. Forces real constitutional change. When you do this, that means subpoint A is that they must pass amendments in order to change the Constitution. Right now we have a patchwork of precedents and cases and stare decisis that gets followed and overturned and followed again, but the real meaning of the Constitution isn't changed. You can look at abortion rights and the Dred Scott case. These would require actual constitutional change.
Ready to get going?
Yep.
Okay. Fantastic speech as always, Tommy. But just a couple questions of clarification. Starting off here, what are the other types of constitutional interpretation in today's round?
I didn't bring any of them in here.
Okay.
I was
So
hoping that
when
maybe
you-
you'd have some
Yeah.
that you think are better.
So
than
when
what
you're
we have
saying
now.
something is the preferred method, what is it preferred to?
For me, it's any other method.
Okay. Can you just elaborate on what those other methods may be?
Well, there's judicial activism. That's a method where there's also a method where I'm not sure what it's called, but it's basically trying to interpret it in today's world or today's society. And there are also different types of originalism where
Right.
there's like founder's intent and things of that nature.
Okay. So you talk about in your second contention, first of all, you said that there were 2 subpoints. I only caught subpoint A. What was your subpoint B?
And basically just the impact that any judge can change what the Constitution means
Got
just
it.
with spin.
So you mentioned that, Supreme Court justices, justices in general, are not policymakers, but are they mind readers?
They're not mind
Are they
readers, which is
historians?
why
Are they historians?
many of them are legal historians.
Legal
They kind
historians.
of have to be in order to be a Supreme Court judge.
And can you remind us what exactly originalism is looking at? Is it looking only at legal precedent, or is it looking at context as well?
It's primarily looking at both the context of what they were writing about and specifically the meanings of the term, like due process, the
And-
meanings of some of these terms
Right.
that we don't use anymore.
And so just to clarify, the sources you gave in your speech were Justice Coney Barrett, Justice Scalia. Was there anyone else you talked about, or any other sources?
Gorsuch, with the pre-elections.
Are all 3 of those people not originalist?
They are all originalists.
So
yes.
why is it fair to say that originalism is better because originalists say it's better?
Well, the argument I'm making is that their logic holds, no matter who they are.
Right.
The logic behind why they are originalist informs what the primacy of that theory is.
Okay, thank you very much, Tommy. Okay, everybody ready? Tommy? Okay. This is the first time you're hearing me speak on this side of the negation, so I again want to thank both of you for being here. Tommy's one of my favorite people in the circuit, which is why we're recording it to begin with. The conversation today is about a topic: originalism ought to be the preferred method of constitutional interpretation. What I'm going to do in this speech is start off by going a little over top case, we'll talk about my case, and then we'll go to Tommy's where it applies. But starting off with that definition here, he talks to us about what originalism is, and he defined it through a quote from Amy Coney Barrett. I think this quote does miss the mark a little bit when it comes to the nuance of the difference between constitutionalism and other forms of constitutional interpretation, so I am going to read a specific definition for you. It is the interpretation given the original public meaning that it would have had at the time it became law. What this means, Judge, is we're not looking at this textually, meaning based on the words in the Constitution in and of itself, but we need to apply the Constitution as it was applied or intended to be applied when the document or the various amendments were written. This matters today, Judge. Additionally, another thing I want to point off right away is the fact that my opponent decided to not define the majority of words in the definition, and that is going to be an issue for a few reasons. First, the word ought, Judge, we need to look at some type of consequence, right? We have to say what would be a good idea, what would be advantageous, some variation, because this resolution is asking us, if we do this, is it more good or more bad? Because of that, that word needed to be defined. But additionally, we talk about the preferred method, and it's probably going to be the most important thing in today's round that my opponent didn't define or engage with this. He's failed his prima facie burden, Judge. At the end of today's round, if you believe absolutely every word that Tommy told you today, all you believe is that originalism is good, which 1, I don't believe is true, we'll talk about, but 2, is not enough to say that it is the preferred method, meaning he didn't meet that burden and already has lost today's round, given that was his prima facie job as the affirmation team. Additionally, we want to talk about his sources before we get into the content, Judge. throughout his case, and we clarified this in cross-ex, he only gave us 3 constitutional judges, all sitting on the court currently, apart from Scalia, obviously, who's passed away, and all of those people are originalists. Of course they are able to, like Tommy said, justices, anything in general, you can make a good argument for. That's why we're in debate. You can make a good argument for constitutionalism, but that neglects the comparative analysis that is required by the resolution to say it's preferred. Additionally, he doesn't give you any type of legal sources, legal experts, anyone else engaging with his ideas, and I think he made that choice for a reason. But let's talk about what that reason is by going to my first contention, which is not historians. Not historians. Now, Tommy told you that they're not policymakers, and I agree. Interpreting the Constitution in a policymaking fashion is a dangerous thing. But what we know is that these politicians are also not historians. We look at the Constitution Accountability Center, as well as Chicago law. We talk about how the court is not trained in history. Now, they may read legal precedents, but that is not the same thing as understanding the historical context, which is inherent to originalism. Tommy talks about this in his first contention, right? He talks to you about free speech, guns, and other elements as well. Let's specifically talk about that gun example here, right? In the Constitution, we were given the right to bear arms. The reason and intent behind that was so that the people could rise up against the government and overthrow it if they need to. An originalist is going to interpret this by saying the way that we should allow people to bear arms is going to be to allow them to rise up the government and destroy it. But we know our government has better technology right now. If a true originalist is interpreting that amendment, they're going to make sure that citizens have the right to have nuclear weapons, right to have tanks, and other extreme weaponry, because that is the original intent of that element of the Constitution. I think we can agree that that's going to be a dangerous thing to know. Additionally, we know that they are not trained in this history, so even a judge who is doing their best to uphold this principle simply does not have the same type of educational backing as those who actually engage with history, who actually do this in a very different way. Nor should they, because they need to understand the legal precedents much more than they should the societal, given that we do not live in that generation anymore. My second contention for you today is going to be living document. Living document. And Judge, this is really important because when the founders made the Constitution, they made sure it could be a living document by allowing us the constitutional amendment process, letting us know that yes, this document will change, it will flow, which is why we allow the Supreme Court to be interpreters of the Constitution, like Tommy said. If everything in the Constitution was meant to have one fixed meaning, then why do we need anybody there to interpret it at all? We know what it means. But that's not the way it works, and that's not the way it was intended to work. Chicago law talks about this as well, that there's no realistic alternative to allowing the Constitution to be a legal document. We as a nation have changed. The Constitution is able to change, but the interpretation doesn't happen without policy reform, like my opponent told you. My third contention is going to be alternatives. And this is very important, Judge. Ultimately, there are many ways to view the Constitution, and a lot of them do ground it in the ideals of the original text without having to be originalism. For example, we have historical grounding, textual grounding, structural, doctrinal, prudential, traditional, moral. There's a million different ways to look at the Constitution, but they do not all require us to interpret it moving to the future from the ways of the past. For example, I, despite being a liberal in politics, consider myself a constitutional conservative because that means I care about the wording of the text specifically. That said, we have to apply it as times change. There are a million different ways to view the Constitution that still leave the integrity that was originally there and don't allow judges to be political actors with it. But let's look at Tommy's case today. His first contention was this idea that it is not inherently outdated. I already gave you the response to the first 2 subpoints of that, but the third one here is how they decide. Judge, he says that they go to sources, but ultimately all they can do is do their best to try to guesstimate what the founders mean. We don't have access to them. We can't talk to them about their intent. We can't talk to them about these things. We have to do guesstimation. The way we interpret those other texts, Judge, is just as possible to change as everything else Tommy warned you about. The second contention was this idea of benefits. He really talked about that they're not policymakers. Well, Judge, a couple things again. One, there are other types that my opponent simply does not engage with that do not require justices to become policymakers. And third, again, he talks about forces of constitutional change. That relies on Congress. That's all. Thank you.
Got a couple questions for you.
Oh, I forgot about cross-ex. I've been doing this for like 13 years and I forget about cross-ex. I'm so sorry.
Man.
All right.
Let's go.
2 minutes on the clock?
Yes,
Ready?
sir.
Okay. Would you trust an English lit teacher to teach you about Shakespeare?
It depends what they're trying to teach me about. They can teach me skills to
The
analyze
meaning
it.
of the plays.
They can interpret it.
Okay, but they can't tell you what those words specifically mean and what what
Right.
Chaucer meant by saying one that April.
So again, there's a couple different directions to view this. An English lit teacher can either tell me what they think Shakespeare meant when he said it, they can tell me ways to interpret it, they can tell me, there's a lot of opportunity. I know I took literature classes where we were asked to read a poem or read a story, and we would all come back with different
But you would
interpretations.
trust them to say what one sentence means translated into modern English.
I think they could probably translate the words, but I don't believe that they could give a factual understanding of what Shakespeare meant when he wrote the words, no.
Okay, what if Shakespeare had a bunch of writings where he expressed exactly what he meant?
In some circumstances that might exist, but we know he certainly wouldn't for all of his work. And today when we're looking at the Constitution, originalism would have to be applied across the board, not in one area or another. That's not how jurisprudence works.
When you talk about the specific textual, and you talk about in the top case, at what point was I saying that this wasn't any kind of specific textual
What do you mean?
thing? Well, that they're interpreting specifically what the terms mean as written, not what what the words mean.
Yeah, no, I was
of the
clarifying the difference between originalism and other forms of jurisprudence that allow us to go based on the text and interpret those texts in modern society. Because originalism asks for the same social implication as well, which is why I gave the gun analysis that I did. It's not the same.
Did I define it as the same social implication?
That's why I was giving the clarification of the definition of originalism as it actually functions.
Was my definition unreasonable or
Your definition was
non-functional?
inaccurate. Your definition was a quote from an originalist judge.
Can you give me your definition?
Yeah, so the definition of originalism from, again, legal sources, the way it actually interprets, is interpretation that gives the original public meaning that it would have at the time it became law. Meaning original intent, framers' intent, not just framers' words.
Okay, that's what your interpretation of public meaning is?
That is what originalism means.
Okay.
Yes.
Alright, you okay? Good. Alright. 3 minutes, I'm gonna have to go kind of quickly here, and I'll just follow the exact same roadmap and arguments that my opponent did in her case. When we talk about the top case, this is very specifically, I'm arguing, we agree that originalism, well, we don't agree that originalism is textual. My definition is very, very close to my opponent's definition and is quite reasonable. The belief that the constitutional text means what it did at the time it was written and that this public meaning is authoritative. It's just a different wording of my opponent's definition. But the public meaning part is not necessarily just framers' intent, it's also the actual meanings of the terms that we don't use today or have different meanings today than they did back then. That's specifically what the originalism is referring to. When we talk about the idea that, the idea that I'm supposed to give alternative methods, this is a disagreement Lindsay and I have on debate theory, first and foremost. I don't believe that it is my job to give my opponent the tools with which they could beat me. So it's not my job to come up and say, here are all these other methods and originalism is better. My job is to say originalism is the best. It is the preferred method. And it is all negative ground to come up here and give any other, literally pick any other interpretation of the Constitution and argue for that, which has not been done. You haven't been given a method of preference over originalism. You haven't been given one type of constitutional interpretation that is better than originalism. So just for that reason, the only voting argument you have comes from the affirmative. When we talk about the fact that that a lot of my evidence was written by originalists, yes, it was, but I'm not making an argument to authority. I'm saying that these arguments are correct. It doesn't matter who's saying it, whether it's an originalist saying it or whether it's me up here saying it, the arguments still hold weight. The idea that it limits judge bias doesn't really go answered against. And this is a very good benefit. The idea that it forces real constitutional change by forcing amendments to pass, that's the only reason we got over the Dred Scott case was because we passed the 14th Amendment. So it forces these long-standing, non-patchwork solutions to problems that we have. I'll give you a very quick solution to the abortion rights bill. Pass an amendment guaranteeing the right to abortion. You can do that if you have enough states. The idea that these people are not historians, they're trained in legal ideas, they have expert opinions, they bring in people other than themselves to read these to read these opinions, which is why early on or in the middle of the century, it became popular for judges to actually ask psychologists for their opinion. These judges aren't just making things up as they go. Most of them were law professors at one point. So when we talk about the idea that this is a living document, again, it is living, which is why you can make an amendment, and the applicability does not change.
Everybody ready? Okay. So already my last time speaking to you as the NAG. I know it's, a longer speech, but it's still only the second one, so I'm a little bummed out to be done after this. But let's sorry.
Pause quickly.
Yeah.
It's had my timer on 3 minutes.
No worries. Thank you for knowing that.
Yep.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay. Back into it. Thank you guys for being here. Topic today is going to be originalism ought to be the preferred method of constitutional interpretation. And Judge, the first thing I'm going to remind you about again is the prima facie burden in today's round. Tommy's job, or any affirmative team's job, is to prove the resolution as true within their very first speech. Anytime in IPDA ever, that is always how we function. Because the affirmative team should be able to be right based on what they have to say. They shouldn't need me to be wrong in order for them to be right. When we look at the resolution today, it has the phrase preferred method. Preferred implies preferred to something else. The fact that Tommy in his speech didn't give us any alternatives to compare it to means that he did not weigh the harms of other systems. Meanwhile, when we look at the negative case today, what I spent a good portion doing is outlining to you the harms of originalism, the dangers of originalism, as well as providing you with what the alternatives are. Now, Tommy said I didn't talk about those, but Judge, it's my entire third contention, letting you know what the alternatives are, how they may pull some elements of originalism in, but do so in a much less dangerous way. We talked about this with textualism, for example, when I was letting you can interpret based on the words, but understand that our culture means something different. And so in this case, a little specifically here, again, that first contention of that it's not inherently outdated. But Judge, when we look at this, I gave you analysis on his subpoint B here, specifically about the guns. This is an analysis that he dropped. When we look at what the intent was, or how it was originally written, that amendment to our Constitution, it was done so to give us the right to bear arms and rise up against our government. If this is applied in the status quo, the consequence of that is to allow the individual citizen to have military weaponry so that they would be able to theoretically overthrow the government. This is a danger and this is bad. That's why we shouldn't prefer it. Ultimately, when we understand that today's round, Judge, we're going to go ahead and move away from originalism. Next, this idea of benefits. Here he really talked about how the judges are not policymakers, but I already let you know that there are other ways to interpret the Constitution that do not require judges to be policymakers. I agree that our judicial system should not be a bunch of people trying to advance their own agendas, but at the point where we have a Supreme Court there to interpret the Constitution, they have to be allowed to interpret it. Saying that, well, what it meant when it was written is how it's going to always be applied removes the need for a Supreme Court to begin with. This is another piece of analysis that Tommy simply did not engage with. And remember, it's too late for any new lines of argumentation in today's round. Third contention here, you talk about how it forces constitutional change. There, I know it was just at the end, but I still did say that it relies on Congress. Ultimately, Judge, we know that Congress is a little tough to get things done sometimes, but the Constitution in any world will still be allowed to be a living document in that sense, where it's able to have change via the constitutional convention or things of that nature. You still have to do that in order to change the Constitution, even if you don't view it as an originalist. Now, I'm going to kind of go over my points, but we'll do so through some of the big questions. The first really big question is probably on your mind, Judge, is what the heck is originalism anyway? I'm not changing his definition. At no point did I. But I did point out to you that the definition he provided, the way he gave it to us, was a quote from an originalist herself. So what I did was offer you the actual foundational definition of originalism, which again is going to be the interpretation given the original public meaning that it would have had at the time it became law, meaning the way it impacted the public at the time in which it was written into law. So Tommy's conjecture there simply does not hold weight. Additionally, when we move on to the next question here, how do we know, right? How do we know what the originalists even intended? Now, Tommy tried to compare this by talking about Shakespeare. Judge, we know that Shakespeare wrote with a lot of metaphors and poetry and stuff anyway. There is no factual definition for how he means something necessarily. And even if there is, it doesn't mean it would be applicable today. This is even more true when we look specifically at the Constitution. We talked about this in my first contention where I point out they're not historians, and I brought you a quote from Justice Breyer himself, where he wrote that in a court decision. decision saying, listen, we're not historians. They may be able to rely on other experts, have some conversations, but that's simply not the same thing. So if somebody interpreting our Constitution identifies as an originalist, that's dangerous. They're not trained in history. Third real question here is why why the Constitution is interpreted, right? Like, why do we have the court to begin with? And it's there to interpret the Constitution as Tommy himself told you. The only way that exists truly is with these other forms of jurisprudence. So now what I'm going to do is go into some voters or reasons I want you to sign your ballot to the side of the negation in today's round, Judge. And ultimately, let's remind ourselves of that weighing mechanism, right? We're looking at this with probability. So ultimately, if you believe that the majority of the time I'm going to be right, please vote for the negative. My first voter is going to be that prima facie burden. Judge, at the end of today, this is the only thing that has to matter. Tommy, after his first speech, didn't convince you that it was the preferred method, even if he did convince you that it was a good method. Because he didn't engage with other ideas, you simply cannot believe that word preferred, and that went unrefuted. My second voter for you today is going to be that the original definition, or originalism is dangerous. Originalism is dangerous. And I gave you some examples of this throughout my speech already. But when we don't allow the Constitution to be amended or idealized for these other interpretations that I gave in my third contention, it's a danger to us all. Thank you.
Ready?
Yep.
All right, 3 minutes on the clock. So first, I'm going to basically sum up some of the major arguments and then give you some voting reasons for why I've clearly proven that there is no other method present in this round that should be preferred over originalism. When we talk about this prima facie burden thing, again, this is kind of a whole theory thing. It's not an IPDA rule that I have to give other points of comparison. My contention is that it is not my job to give my opponent their tools to which to beat me, right? The idea, the entire wording of the resolution says preferred method. That means the best method. That means that I'm arguing that every single other method is not as good as constitutionalism. Now, if I'm supposed to come up here and list off every single other method of constitutional interpretation, that's not fair to me. I'll run out of time before I even start to get to make any points for why originalism is the best, if my entire speech is just listing all of the types of constitutional interpretation. So that's why it's my opponent's job, and when she talks about engaging with the other ideas, that's why it's my opponent's job to provide those other ideas that I'm supposed to engage with and decide, you as the judge, decide which of these ideas are better. But you have not been given any other method that is preferable to originalism, and that's an automatic win for the affirmative. There is no negation of the Constitution, of the resolution if my opponent just says, well, originalism does have some harms. That may be true, but it's not a negation saying that it's not the most preferred method, especially when there hasn't been any other methods that you should prefer over it given. So yeah, maybe it's not perfect, but it's the most perfect one you have in the round to vote on. And then when we get to the kind of definitional argument where we talk about public meaning, we have two different interpretations of what public meaning is. My interpretation of the public meaning in both definitions, both Barrett's and the legal one that was given, is that public meaning is what the words meant to the public at the time, the connotations of those words as they were used. And we don't use those words the same way right now, which is why it's important for them to go back and read the definitions of those days, and that way they can interpret it. And we talk about the idea of the fact that they're not historians. Again, these people are legal historians. They're trained in history. You can expect an old English teacher to translate Chaucer into modern English, just like you would expect a judge to translate the English of the Constitution into the English of today's day. So really quickly, some voters for why the originalism is the preferred method. One, because it's the only method you have in this round. You have not been given any competing method, definitely not one that's better. So that's an automatically win. And the ideas of the idea that it limits judge bias and that there's no other way to limit it like this also flows to why it's the best.
Always fun.
Amazing.
Good job, my friends.
Woo!